My name is Sarah Mitchell, I'm 28 years old, and I'm standing on the courthouse steps with my heart pounding so hard I can barely breathe. Behind me, my parents are whispering just loud enough for me to hear every cruel word. "This is embarrassing, Richard," my mother hisses. She's delusional if she thinks anyone will believe her ridiculous story. My father chuckles coldly. Let her make a fool of herself. Maybe then she'll finally grow up and stop living in fantasy land. The courthouse doors swing open, and I take my first step inside. My parents roll their eyes in perfect unison, shaking their heads as if I'm a child throwing a tantrum. But they have no idea what I'm about to reveal. Before we dive into this incredible story of family betrayal and shocking courtroom drama, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that like button if you're ready for a wild ride, and make sure to subscribe because this story has more twists than you could ever imagine. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when the judge hears what I have to say. Now, let me take you back to where this nightmare began. 6 months ago, my world shattered when my beloved grandmother, Margaret Rose Mitchell, passed away peacefully in her sleep at 84 years old. Grandma Rose wasn't just my grandmother, she was my best friend, my confidant, and the only person in my family who truly understood me. While my parents and siblings saw her antique shop as a dusty old relic, I spent countless hours there as a child, learning about history, listening to her stories, and dreaming of the day I might take over the family business she'd built from nothing over 40 years. The will reading took place on a gray October morning in the stuffy office of Harold Sterling, the family lawyer who'd handled Grandma Rose's affairs for decades. I remember sitting in that burgundy leather chair, my hands folded in my lap, watching as Sterling cleared his throat and began reading the document that would supposedly determine our futures. My parents, Richard and Diane Mitchell, sat rigid with anticipation, while my older brother Brandon lounged carelessly in his chair, checking his phone every few minutes. My younger sister Jessica kept filing her nails, clearly bored by the entire proceeding. When Sterling announced that everything, the Victorian house, the antique shop, and all of Grandma Rose's considerable savings, had been left to my parents, I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. This couldn't be right. For years, Grandma Rose had told me stories about how the shop would be mine one day, how she was saving it for someone who truly appreciated the history and craftsmanship of the pieces she'd collected. She'd even started teaching me about appraisals, inventory management, and the intricate details of running a successful antique business. There must be some mistake, I whispered, my voice barely audible in the suddenly silent room. My parents exchanged glances, and I caught something in their expressions that made my stomach turn. Relief? Satisfaction? It was as if they'd been expecting this outcome all along. Sterling barely looked up from the papers as he assured me the will was perfectly clear and legally binding. My father placed a patronizing hand on my shoulder and suggested I was simply disappointed, which was natural, but I needed to accept Grandma Rose's final wishes. Within days of the funeral, my parents began making changes that felt like desecration. They hired an estate sale company to come through the house, pricing and tagging everything from Grandma Rose's china collection to her handwritten recipe cards. The antique shop, which had been Grandma Rose's pride and joy, was listed with a commercial realtor before I'd even had time to process my grief. When I begged them to wait, to give me time to at least go through her things properly, my mother laughed that cold, dismissive laugh I'd grown to hate. "Sarah, honey, you need to face reality," Diane said, not bothering to look up from her real estate listings. Mother was getting old, and clearly she wasn't thinking straight about business matters. "This shop has been losing money for years. We're actually doing everyone a favor by selling it to someone who can turn it into something profitable." The casual cruelty in her voice, the way she reduced 40 years of Grandma Rose's passion to a failed business venture, made me feel sick. I tried reasoning with Brandon and Jessica, hoping they might remember how special the shop had been to our grandmother. Brandon just shrugged and said he needed his inheritance money to pay off credit card debts. Jessica was more direct in her dismissal, telling me I was being weird and obsessive about some old furniture and dusty books. Neither of them seemed to understand that this wasn't about money for me, It was about preserving our grandmother's legacy and honoring the promises she'd made to me throughout my childhood. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. While helping my parents clear out Grandma Rose's bedroom, I discovered her old jewelry box hidden behind some hat boxes in the closet. Inside, underneath the costume jewelry and old photographs, I found a manila envelope containing documents that made my blood run cold. There were handwritten notes in Grandma Rose's distinctive script, discussing her concerns about my parents' financial situation and their growing pressure on her to make changes to her will. There were also copies of correspondence with a different lawyer, someone named Thomas Brennan, dated just 3 months before her death. My hands were shaking as I read through page after page of documentation that told a completely different story than the one Sterling had presented in his office. According to these papers, Grandma Rose had been actively working to ensure the antique shop and house would come to me, with specific provisions to prevent my parents from interfering with her wishes. The documents outlined her concerns about my father's gambling debts and my mother's expensive shopping habits, fears that they would simply sell everything for quick cash rather than preserving the family legacy she'd worked so hard to build. I immediately called Thomas Brennan's office and arranged a meeting. Brennan was a small, nervous man who seemed genuinely surprised to hear from me. When I showed him the documents, his face went pale. He explained that Grandma Rose had indeed been working with him to create a new will, one that would leave the business to me while providing financial support to my parents. However, she had passed away before the new will could be properly executed and witnessed. According to Brennan, the old will with Sterling should have reflected those changes, but apparently it hadn't been updated. Armed with this information, I confronted my parents that evening. The scene that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced in our family before. My father's face turned red with rage as he accused me of trying to steal from my own family. My mother's reaction was even worse, cold and calculating as she suggested I was having some sort of emotional breakdown brought on by grief. They dismissed Brennan's documents as meaningless drafts and insisted that Sterling's will was the only legal document that mattered. The next day, I discovered that my parents had hired Caroline Whitmore, one of the most expensive estate attorneys in the city, to represent them. Whitmore immediately filed papers to block any legal challenge I might attempt, claiming I was acting under emotional duress and questioning my mental competency to make such decisions. When I tried to access my trust fund to hire my own lawyer, I discovered that my parents had frozen my accounts, claiming they were protecting family assets from my erratic behavior. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. These were the people who had raised me, who were supposed to love and support me, and they were treating me like an enemy. They began spreading rumors throughout our extended family and social circle, painting me as an ungrateful daughter who was trying to steal her dead grandmother's inheritance. Friends stopped calling, relatives avoided me at social gatherings, and I began to understand just how far my parents were willing to go to protect what they saw as rightfully theirs. As the weeks passed, I became increasingly convinced that something was fundamentally wrong with the entire situation. Grandma Rose had been sharp as a tack right up until her death, still managing her shop's inventory and handling complex business negotiations with dealers and collectors. The idea that she would have forgotten about her promises to me or suddenly decided to leave everything to my parents made no sense whatsoever. I started studying the will more carefully, comparing the handwriting and signatures with other documents I'd found in her jewelry box. Using what little money I had left from my teaching salary, I hired Jack Morrison, a private investigator who specialized in estate fraud. Morrison was a gruff former police detective who took on my case more out of curiosity than competence in my claims. He spent 2 weeks conducting interviews and reviewing public records before calling me to his office with news that turned my world upside down once again. "Your parents visited Harold Sterling's office 6 times in the 3 months before your grandmother's death," Morrison reported, spreading photographs and timeline documentation across his desk. "That's unusual for routine estate planning, especially considering Sterling claims he barely knew your parents before the will reading." The photographs showed my parents entering and leaving Sterling's building at odd hours, sometimes carrying briefcases and manila envelopes, always looking around nervously as if they didn't want to be seen. Morrison had also discovered financial records showing that Sterling's law practice was in serious trouble. The man was facing bankruptcy, had defaulted on his office lease twice in the past year, and was under investigation by the State Bar Association for mishandling client funds. The timing of my parents' visits coincided perfectly with large cash deposits into Sterling's personal bank account, payments that had no corresponding invoices or documentation in his business records. "I think your parents bought themselves a will," Morrison said bluntly. "Sterling needed money, and your parents needed to make sure they inherited everything before your grandmother could change her mind. The question is whether we can prove it." He'd already identified several inconsistencies in the will's language and formatting that suggested it had been altered after the original document was created. The paper quality was different between pages, the ink showed signs of being applied at different times, and most damning of all, there were tiny differences in the handwriting that suggested forgery. Armed with Morrison's evidence, I approached Thomas Brennan again, hoping he might be willing to support my challenge to Sterling's will. Brennan was terrified, admitting that he'd been receiving threatening phone calls warning him to stay away from the Mitchell family business. Someone had also broken into his office, though nothing valuable had been stolen, just files that had been rifled through and left in obvious disarray. It was clear that my parents were playing for keeps, and they weren't going to let anyone interfere with their plans. My parents escalated their campaign against me by filing a restraining order, claiming I had been harassing and threatening them. The petition painted a picture of an unstable woman who couldn't accept her grandmother's final wishes and was now lashing out at her family in increasingly dangerous ways. They included statements from neighbors who claimed to have witnessed me shouting at my parents' house, though I had never raised my voice or made any threats whatsoever. The judge granted a temporary order that prevented me from contacting my parents directly or coming within 500 feet of their property. The restraining order was just the beginning. Within days, my parents had contacted the principal at the elementary school where I taught, expressing concerns about my mental state and suggesting that I might not be stable enough to work with children. They painted a picture of a woman obsessed with money and family disputes, someone who might not be able to maintain professional boundaries or emotional control in a classroom setting. The principal, Mrs. Henderson, was sympathetic but explained that the school board would need to investigate any concerns about teacher conduct, especially when they involved family disputes that might affect my ability to perform my duties. My parents also reached out to extended family members, sharing their version of events and asking for support in their efforts to protect the family from my increasingly erratic behavior. Aunts, uncles, and cousins who had known me my entire life began treating me with suspicion and distance. Family gatherings became uncomfortable affairs where conversations stopped when I entered a room, and I could feel the weight of their judgment and disappointment. My parents had successfully painted me as the villain in this story, and I was losing the support system I desperately needed. The isolation was devastating, but it also made me more determined to uncover the truth. I spent every free moment researching estate law, document analysis, and fraud investigation techniques. I learned about handwriting analysis, paper dating, and ink composition testing. I studied legal precedents for challenging wills and gathered examples of other estate fraud cases that had been successfully prosecuted. If my family was going to treat me like an enemy, I was going to arm myself with every piece of knowledge and evidence I could find. The breakthrough came when Morrison introduced me to Helen Anderson, Grandma Rose's next-door neighbor for over 30 years. Mrs. Anderson was a sharp, observant woman in her 70s who had noticed the unusual activity at Grandma Rose's house in the months before her death. She remembered my parents visiting at strange hours, sometimes when Grandma Rose's car wasn't even in the driveway. She'd also observed heated conversations through the kitchen window, arguments that seemed to upset Grandma Rose considerably. "Your grandmother was troubled about something in those last few months," Mrs. Anderson confided during our meeting in her cozy living room. "She mentioned that your parents were pressuring her about financial matters, wanting her to make changes she wasn't comfortable with. She even asked me once if I thought children had the right to dictate how their parents should handle their own affairs." I could tell she was conflicted about something, but she was too proud to admit she was being manipulated. This was the first confirmation I'd received that Grandma Rose had been under pressure, and it validated everything I'd suspected about my parents' involvement in changing her will. Mrs. Anderson also revealed that she had security cameras installed around her property, cameras that might have captured some of the unusual activity at Grandma Rose's house. When we reviewed the footage together, we found several instances of my parents visiting when Grandma Rose wasn't home, using their key to enter the house and spending considerable time inside. On one particularly damning recording, we could see them loading boxes into their car just days after Grandma Rose's funeral, taking items that should have been part of the estate inventory. The evidence was mounting, but I knew my parents weren't going to give up without a fight. They had already proven they were willing to destroy my reputation and relationships to protect their interests. As I prepared to escalate my legal challenge, I had no idea just how far they were prepared to go to silence me permanently. The worst betrayals were still to come, and they would test every ounce of strength and determination I had left. Just when I thought my situation couldn't get any worse, my sister Jessica reached out to me with what seemed like an olive branch. She called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice soft and concerned, explaining that she'd been thinking about everything that had happened and was starting to have doubts about our parents' version of events. "Sarah, I know we haven't always been close, but you're still my sister," she said, and for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope that someone in my family might actually believe me. Jessica suggested we meet for coffee to discuss the situation privately, away from our parents' influence. During that meeting, she seemed genuinely interested in hearing my side of the story and examining the evidence I'd gathered. She asked thoughtful questions about the discrepancies in the will, nodded sympathetically as I explained Morrison's findings, and even offered to help me search through more of Grandma Rose's belongings for additional documentation. I was so desperate for family support that I ignored the small voice in my head warning me to be careful about trusting anyone at that point. Over the following weeks, Jessica and I met several times, and I shared everything with her: copies of all the evidence, Morrison's investigation reports, the security footage from Mrs. Anderson, even my strategy for challenging the will in court. Jessica played the part of the concerned sister perfectly, expressing outrage at our parents' behavior and promising to stand by me when the truth came out. She even suggested that Brandon might be willing to listen if we presented the evidence to him together. I should have recognized the setup, but I was so starved for family connection and support that I missed all the warning signs. Jessica was asking very specific questions about my evidence, wanting exact copies of everything rather than just looking at the originals. She was particularly interested in Morrison's financial records showing the payments to Sterling, and she insisted on having copies of the security footage in case something happened to Mrs. Anderson's originals. I handed over everything, grateful to finally have an ally in my own family. The trap sprung 3 days later when my parents' attorney, Caroline Whitmore, filed a motion claiming that I had been using forged documents and manipulated evidence to support my false claims against the estate. Every piece of evidence I'd shared with Jessica had been analyzed by their experts and declared fraudulent. According to their filing, I had created fake security footage, forged financial records, and even manipulated handwriting samples to support my delusions about the will being illegitimate. The betrayal was so complete and devastating that I couldn't breathe for several minutes after reading Whitmore's filing. Jessica had played me perfectly, gaining my trust and gathering intelligence that my parents could use to destroy my case before it even reached court. When I called her, demanding an explanation, she didn't even try to pretend anymore. "I'm sorry, Sarah, but you're sick," she said coldly. "Mom and Dad are just trying to help you before you hurt yourself or someone else. Maybe now you'll get the mental health treatment you obviously need." Brandon's betrayal came next, and it was even more calculated than Jessica's deception. He contacted my attorney, Thomas Brennan, claiming he wanted to provide testimony supporting my case. Brennan, eager for any family member willing to support our position, agreed to meet with Brandon and record his statement. What Brandon actually provided was a detailed account of my supposedly unstable behavior going back years, stories about obsessive episodes, emotional outbursts, and what he claimed were delusions about Grandma Rose's promises to me. According to Brandon's statement, I had always been jealous of the attention and resources our parents gave to him and Jessica. He claimed that I had fabricated stories about Grandma Rose's promises as a way of getting revenge against the family for my perceived mistreatment. He described incidents from our childhood, twisting normal sibling conflicts into evidence of my mental instability and tendency toward manipulation. He even suggested that I might have pressured Grandma Rose to make promises she never intended to keep, taking advantage of an elderly woman's desire to make her granddaughter feel special. The most damaging part of Brandon's testimony was his claim that I had shown signs of breaking from reality in the weeks following Grandma Rose's death. He described my behavior at the funeral as inappropriate and attention-seeking, suggesting that I had made scenes and accused family members of lying about Grandma Rose's final wishes. He painted a picture of a woman so consumed with greed and resentment that she was willing to destroy her own family to get money she had never been promised. My parents took Brandon's testimony and ran with it, using his supposed first-hand knowledge of my mental state to build a comprehensive case for my incompetency. They filed papers with the court requesting that I be required to undergo psychological evaluation before being allowed to pursue any legal claims against the estate. They also petitioned to have a guardian appointed to manage my affairs, claiming that I was no longer capable of making rational decisions about legal or financial matters. The character assassination campaign extended beyond the legal system into every aspect of my life. My parents contacted colleagues at the school where I worked, expressing concerns about my ability to handle the stress of teaching while dealing with my mental health crisis. They shared carefully edited versions of our family conflicts with neighbors, church members, and longtime family friends, always positioning themselves as concerned parents trying to help a daughter who refused to accept reality or seek appropriate treatment. The social isolation became unbearable as more and more people in my life began treating me with the careful politeness reserved for someone who might be mentally ill. Former friends stopped inviting me to social gatherings, colleagues avoided me in the faculty lounge, and even casual acquaintances seemed uncomfortable making normal conversation. My parents had successfully turned my entire social network against me, creating a reality where anyone who might have supported me was convinced that I was having some sort of breakdown. The cruelest part of their strategy was how they weaponized my grief over Grandma Rose's death against me. They suggested to anyone who would listen that I was unable to process my loss in a healthy way, that my legal challenge was really just an elaborate form of denial about her death. They painted my efforts to honor Grandma Rose's true wishes as an unhealthy obsession that was preventing me from moving forward with my life. Even my own grief became evidence of my supposed mental instability. The systematic destruction of my credibility was so thorough that even Morrison, my private investigator, began expressing doubts about continuing with the case. He'd been contacted by several people claiming to have witnessed my erratic behavior, and the weight of testimony against my mental state was making him question whether he'd been manipulated into supporting false claims. When your own hired investigator starts to doubt your sanity, you realize just how effective a well-orchestrated character assassination campaign can be. As I sat alone in my apartment, reading through the latest legal filings that painted me as a delusional, potentially dangerous woman who needed psychiatric intervention rather than legal representation, I understood that my family had declared total war against me. They weren't just trying to keep the inheritance. They were trying to destroy my ability to function in society. But they had made one crucial mistake in their campaign of destruction. They had underestimated my determination to honor Grandma Rose's memory, and they had forgotten about one person who had known the truth all along. The key to everything lay in the most obvious place, hidden in plain sight in a way that only Grandma Rose would have thought of. While going through her jewelry box one more time, I noticed that the bottom drawer didn't sit quite right. When I examined it more carefully, I discovered a false bottom concealing a small brass key wrapped in a piece of paper with an address I didn't recognize. The address turned out to be a bank across town where Grandma Rose had maintained a safety deposit box for over 20 years, a box that no one else in the family knew existed. Getting access to the box required proving my relationship to Grandma Rose and providing documentation of her death, but the bank manager was helpful once he understood the situation. When the metal door finally opened, I found myself staring at the most comprehensive collection of evidence I could have imagined. Grandma Rose had been methodically documenting everything, creating a detailed record of my parents' increasing pressure and her own growing concerns about their motivations. The original will, dated just 2 months before her death, was completely different from the document Sterling had presented. In this version, Grandma Rose left the house and antique shop to me, with clear instructions that my parents were to serve only as trustees until I was ready to take full control of the business. She'd included specific provisions preventing the sale of the shop for at least 10 years and requiring that any major decisions about the property be approved by an independent board of trustees including Mrs. Anderson and 2 other family friends. Even more damaging were the letters Grandma Rose had written but never sent, documenting her fears about my parents' financial situation and their growing desperation for money. She'd discovered that my father had been gambling heavily at local casinos, running up debts that threatened the family's financial stability. My mother had been spending equally recklessly on luxury items, apparently trying to maintain a lifestyle that their income couldn't support. The letters described numerous conversations where my parents had pressured her to change her will, make loans against the house, or sell valuable antiques to help cover their expenses. The most shocking discovery was a video recording Grandma Rose had made just 3 weeks before her death. In it, she looked directly into the camera and explained her decision to leave everything to me, detailing her concerns about my parents' ability to manage the inheritance responsibly. She spoke about her promises to me throughout my childhood and her hope that I would continue the antique business she'd worked so hard to build. Most importantly, she specifically mentioned her fears that my parents might try to contest or alter her will, and her intention to work with Thomas Brennan to ensure her true wishes were legally protected. If anyone is watching this recording, it means something has happened to prevent my final will from being properly executed, Grandma Rose said in the video, her voice strong and clear despite her age. I want there to be no doubt about my intentions regarding my estate. Sarah is the only member of my family who truly understands and appreciates the work I've done, and she is the only one I trust to preserve the legacy I've spent 40 years building. The video was dated and witnessed by Mrs. Anderson, who had helped Grandma Rose set up the camera and recording equipment. The safety deposit box also contained correspondence between Grandma Rose and Harold Sterling that revealed the true extent of the conspiracy against her. Sterling had been pressuring her to make changes to her will that would benefit my parents, using his position as her longtime attorney to manipulate her into believing that leaving everything to me would create family conflicts. The letters showed that Grandma Rose had become suspicious of Sterling's motives and was planning to transfer her legal affairs to Thomas Brennan, but she had died before completing the transition. Most damning of all were copies of checks and bank transfers showing that my parents had been making regular payments to Sterling for months before Grandma Rose's death. The payments were disguised as legal fees for estate planning, but the amounts were far larger than any reasonable fee for the services Sterling was supposedly providing. The financial records created a clear trail of corruption, showing that Sterling had been bought and paid for long before he presented the false will that disinherited me. Armed with this explosive evidence, I immediately contacted Thomas Brennan and arranged an emergency meeting. When Brennan saw the contents of the safety deposit box, his face went white. "This changes everything," he said, studying the original will and the video recording. "Your grandmother clearly intended for you to inherit the business, and these financial records prove that Sterling was being bribed by your parents to falsify her final wishes." He agreed to take over my case immediately and file for an emergency injunction to stop the sale of Grandma Rose's property. However, my parents weren't going to give up without a fight. Within hours of Brennan filing our motion, they responded with the most serious escalation yet. Whitmore filed criminal charges against me, claiming that I had broken into the bank and stolen documents from a safety deposit box that didn't belong to me. According to their version of events, I had forged documents giving me access to the box and created fake evidence to support my delusions about the inheritance. The criminal charges were devastating because they carried the possibility of jail time and would have completely destroyed any credibility I had left. My parents held a press conference, standing beside Whitmore as she explained how their mentally ill daughter had resorted to criminal activity in her obsession with stealing her grandmother's estate. They painted themselves as heartbroken parents who had tried everything to get me the help I needed, but were now forced to protect themselves and their community from my increasingly dangerous behavior. The media attention was a nightmare. Local news stations picked up the story of the family inheritance dispute, focusing on the dramatic elements of mental illness, criminal charges, and family conflict rather than the evidence of fraud I'd uncovered. My photograph appeared on television and in newspapers alongside descriptions of the charges against me, cementing my reputation as an unstable woman who had gone too far in pursuit of money. The school board immediately placed me on unpaid administrative leave pending resolution of the criminal charges, effectively ending my teaching career. But my parents had made a crucial error in their rush to discredit the safety deposit box evidence. They had forgotten about Mrs. Anderson's role as a witness to Grandma Rose's video recording and her knowledge of the box's existence. When investigators interviewed her about my supposed break-in at the bank, she was able to provide testimony and documentation proving that Grandma Rose had shown her the key and explained her intentions for the contents of the box. Mrs. Anderson's credibility as an elderly neighbor with no financial stake in the outcome was unimpeachable, and her testimony began to unravel my parents' latest fabrication. More importantly, the bank's security footage and access records proved that I had followed proper procedures for accessing the safety deposit box, providing legitimate documentation of my relationship to Grandma Rose and authorization from the estate. The bank manager was prepared to testify that I had never attempted to access the box illegally or presented fraudulent documents. The criminal charges that were supposed to destroy my credibility instead became evidence of my parents' willingness to file false police reports in their campaign to silence me. As the truth about the safety deposit box became clear, other people who had known Grandma Rose began coming forward with their own observations about my parents' behavior in the months before her death. The picture that emerged was of an elderly woman under increasing pressure from financially desperate adult children who saw her assets as the solution to their problems. Grandma Rose had confided her concerns to several trusted friends, creating a network of potential witnesses who could corroborate the evidence I'd found in her final hiding place. With the evidence from the safety deposit box in hand, Thomas Brennan recommended that I needed more aggressive legal representation than his small practice could provide. He introduced me to Michael Wellington, a partner at the prestigious firm Wellington and Associates, who specialized in complex estate fraud cases. Wellington was everything Sterling wasn't: sharp, ethical, and completely unimpressed by my parents' expensive legal team or their media manipulation tactics. Wellington immediately recognized the significance of what we'd uncovered and assembled a team of investigators, forensic accountants, and document experts to build an ironclad case. His first move was to subpoena Sterling's financial records, forcing him to produce documentation of every payment he'd received from my parents and every service he'd supposedly provided in return. The investigation revealed that Sterling's law practice was essentially bankrupt, kept afloat only by the money my parents had been paying him to falsify Grandma Rose's will. The forensic examination of the will Sterling had presented revealed multiple layers of fraud. Document experts confirmed that pages had been substituted after the original will was signed, using different paper and ink that dated to several months after Grandma Rose's death. Handwriting analysis proved that key sections had been forged, copying Grandma Rose's signature from other documents and adding it to provisions she had never actually approved. The level of deception was so extensive that it constituted multiple felonies, not just civil fraud. Wellington's team also uncovered the full extent of my parents' financial problems, which were far worse than even Grandma Rose had realized. My father owed over $200,000 to various creditors, including several casino operations that had been pressuring him for payment. My mother had racked up enormous credit card debts, financing a lifestyle of expensive clothes, jewelry, and vacations that their middle-class income couldn't support. They weren't just greedy, they were desperate, facing potential bankruptcy and social humiliation if they couldn't access Grandma Rose's assets quickly. The investigation revealed that my parents had been planning their inheritance grab for over a year before Grandma Rose's death. They'd researched Harold Sterling's financial problems and approached him with their proposition, offering to pay his debts in exchange for his cooperation in falsifying the will. They'd also been systematically isolating Grandma Rose from other family members and friends who might have questioned their increasing control over her affairs. Most disturbing was the evidence that my parents had been manipulating Grandma Rose's medication in the final months of her life. They had convinced her doctor to prescribe sleeping pills and anxiety medication, claiming she was having trouble sleeping and was worried about family finances. The medications made her drowsy and confused, creating opportunities for them to pressure her into signing documents she might not have fully understood. While this didn't directly cause her death, it showed the lengths they were willing to go to control her decisions. Sterling, facing potential disbarment and criminal prosecution, agreed to cooperate with Wellington's investigation in exchange for a plea agreement. His testimony revealed the full scope of the conspiracy, including details about how my parents had planned to handle any challenge to their fabricated will. They had developed an elaborate strategy to destroy my credibility, including the fake mental health crisis narrative and the systematic campaign to turn my family and friends against me. According to Sterling's confession, my parents had anticipated that I might discover discrepancies in the will and had prepared their character assassination campaign months in advance. They had coached Jessica and Brandon on what to say about my supposed mental health problems, created false documentation of my erratic behavior, and even planted witnesses who would support their version of events. The restraining order, the criminal charges, and the media campaign were all part of a coordinated effort to make me appear too unstable to pursue legal action. Wellington used Sterling's cooperation to set a trap for my parents. We arranged for Sterling to contact them, claiming that I had discovered evidence that could expose their fraud and that they needed to meet urgently to discuss damage control. The meeting was recorded, providing clear evidence of my parents admitting to their role in falsifying the will and discussing strategies for maintaining their deception. They also made incriminating statements about their willingness to continue destroying my reputation and relationships to protect themselves. With Sterling's confession and the recorded admissions from my parents, Wellington filed a comprehensive motion exposing the entire conspiracy and requesting that the court invalidate Sterling's false will while recognizing Grandma Rose's true final wishes. The filing included hundreds of pages of evidence, expert testimony, and witness statements that painted a complete picture of how my parents had defrauded their own mother and then systematically destroyed their daughter's life to cover up their crimes. My parents' response was predictably vicious. They fired Caroline Whitmore and hired an even more aggressive attorney who specialized in attacking opposing parties' credibility rather than defending his client's actions. The new lawyer, Robert Hutchinson, immediately filed motions claiming that Wellington's evidence had been obtained illegally and that Sterling's cooperation had been coerced through threats and intimidation. He also escalated the personal attacks against me, filing new claims about my mental health and suggesting that I had manipulated Sterling into changing his testimony through promises or threats. Hutchinson's strategy was to create so much confusion and controversy around the evidence that the court would be unable to determine what was true. He brought in expert witnesses who challenged every aspect of our case, claiming that document analysis was unreliable, that witness testimony was tainted by bias, and that the recorded conversations were taken out of context. He painted my parents as victims of a vindictive daughter who had enlisted corrupt lawyers and investigators to fabricate evidence supporting her delusional claims. The legal battle became a war of attrition, with both sides filing hundreds of motions, depositions, and expert reports. My parents' strategy was clearly to exhaust our resources and drag out the proceedings until I gave up or ran out of money to continue fighting. They had unlimited access to Grandma Rose's estate to fund their legal defense, while I was struggling to pay Wellington's fees despite his generous payment plan. The irony of them using the money they'd stolen from me to prevent me from recovering it wasn't lost on anyone involved in the case. The public attention continued to be overwhelmingly negative for me, as Hutchinson was much more skilled at media manipulation than Wellington's team. He held regular press conferences portraying my parents as elderly victims of a greedy daughter's false accusations, while painting me as someone so obsessed with money that I was willing to destroy my own family to get it. The narrative of the mentally ill woman making wild accusations against her loving parents was much more compelling to reporters than the complex financial fraud we'd actually uncovered. As we approached the trial date, I realized that everything would come down to what happened in that courtroom. All of Wellington's evidence, all of the witness testimony, all of Sterling's confessions would mean nothing if we couldn't convince a judge that my parents were capable of the elaborate fraud we'd uncovered. The stakes couldn't have been higher. My inheritance, my reputation, my family relationships, and my freedom all depended on what would happen when I finally got the chance to speak the truth in front of someone with the power to do something about it. The initial court hearings were devastating setbacks that made me question whether justice would ever be possible. Judge Robert Harrison was a conservative, elderly man who seemed immediately skeptical of my claims against my parents. During preliminary proceedings, he made comments that suggested he viewed the entire situation as a family squabble that had gotten out of hand rather than a serious case of estate fraud. His demeanor toward my parents was respectful and sympathetic, while his interactions with me were marked by barely concealed irritation and doubt. The first major blow came when Judge Harrison granted my parents' motion for a temporary restraining order that prevented me from interfering with their administration of Grandma Rose's estate. Despite all of Wellington's evidence about the forged will, the judge ruled that until the matter was fully resolved in trial, my parents should continue to have control over the assets they had inherited. This meant they could continue selling off Grandma Rose's possessions and liquidating her business while our legal challenge worked its way through the system. Within days of the judge's ruling, my parents accelerated their destruction of everything Grandma Rose had built. The antique shop was sold to a developer who planned to tear down the building and construct a modern retail space. 40 years of carefully curated inventory was dispersed through estate sales and auction houses, with priceless family heirlooms and historically significant pieces sold to the highest bidders. Watching strangers carry away furniture and artwork that had been part of my childhood was like witnessing the systematic erasure of my grandmother's life's work. My parents also moved quickly to sell Grandma Rose's Victorian house, accepting the first offer they received even though it was significantly below market value. They seemed more interested in converting everything to cash as quickly as possible than in maximizing the value of the estate. Their urgency suggested they knew their fraud would eventually be exposed and they wanted to hide or spend the money before that happened. The house where I'd spent countless happy hours learning from Grandma Rose was stripped of its character and sold to investors who planned to flip it for profit. The criminal charges against me were still pending, and Hutchinson used them skillfully to undermine my credibility in the civil proceedings. Every time Wellington tried to present evidence of my parents' fraud, Hutchinson would remind the court that I was facing felony charges for allegedly fabricating evidence and breaking into bank facilities. He argued that someone who would resort to criminal activity to support her claims clearly couldn't be trusted to tell the truth about anything else. My professional life completely collapsed when the school board voted to terminate my employment based on the criminal charges and the negative publicity surrounding the inheritance dispute. The decision was devastating not just financially, but emotionally, as teaching had been my passion and my connection to a sense of purpose beyond the legal battle. The children I'd worked with for years were now being told by administrators that their former teacher was involved in serious legal troubles, further cementing my reputation as someone who couldn't be trusted. The social isolation reached a point where I could barely function in normal society. Former friends crossed the street to avoid talking to me, neighbors whispered when I walked past, and even grocery store clerks treated me with suspicious hostility. The local media had thoroughly covered Hutchinson's version of events, portraying my parents as dignified elderly victims while casting me as an increasingly unstable woman whose accusations were becoming more outlandish and desperate. Brandon and Jessica's testimony during depositions was particularly crushing because of how completely they had turned against me. Brandon presented detailed accounts of my supposedly erratic behavior going back to childhood, painting me as someone who had always been jealous, manipulative, and prone to elaborate fantasies when reality didn't match my expectations. Jessica was even more damaging, describing conversations where I had supposedly admitted to hating our parents and plotting ways to steal their inheritance. Their testimony was especially effective because it was delivered with apparent reluctance and sadness. They portrayed themselves as siblings who loved me but couldn't ignore the evidence of my mental deterioration. They spoke about their hope that losing the legal battle might finally force me to seek the psychiatric help I clearly needed. The performance was so convincing that even some of Wellington's staff began expressing doubts about whether we were representing the right side in this dispute. My parents orchestrated a particularly vicious public humiliation when they arranged for local news cameras to be present during one of my court appearances. As I walked up the courthouse steps, reporters shouted questions about my mental health, my criminal charges, and my motivations for destroying my own family. My parents were there too, standing with Hutchinson as he held an impromptu press conference describing their heartbreak over their daughter's descent into delusion and criminality. The footage of me looking haggard and desperate while they appeared calm and dignified played on local news for days. The lowest point came when Judge Harrison issued a ruling that essentially accepted my parents' portrayal of me as mentally incompetent. He ordered that I undergo psychological evaluation before being allowed to continue with the legal proceedings, and he appointed a guardian ad litem to review my decisions and ensure that I wasn't being manipulated by my legal team. The ruling was a devastating blow to my credibility and suggested that the court viewed me as someone whose mental state made her testimony unreliable. Wellington tried to maintain optimism, but I could see the strain in his face as he explained how difficult it would be to overcome the judge's apparent bias and the accumulated damage to my reputation. We had compelling evidence of fraud, but convincing a skeptical court that my respectable-looking parents were capable of such elaborate deception was proving nearly impossible. The legal system seemed designed to protect people who appeared stable and successful, regardless of what they had actually done. The psychological evaluation was a nightmare of invasive questions and biased interpretations. The court-appointed psychiatrist seemed to have already formed an opinion based on the news coverage and my family's characterizations of my behavior. Every emotion I expressed was analyzed as evidence of instability, every detail I provided about the fraud was questioned as possible delusion, and every moment of frustration or anger was noted as proof of my inability to handle stress appropriately. When the psychiatrist's report was filed, it was devastating. While stopping short of declaring me mentally incompetent, it raised significant questions about my ability to perceive reality accurately, especially in situations involving family conflict and financial stress. The report suggested that my accusations against my parents might be the result of unresolved grief over Grandma Rose's death, combined with underlying psychological issues that made it difficult for me to accept disappointing news about my inheritance. With the psychological evaluation calling my credibility into question, Judge Harrison issued another ruling that felt like a death blow to our case. He ordered that any settlement discussions should focus on getting me the psychiatric treatment I needed rather than pursuing my claims against the estate. He strongly suggested that my parents might consider establishing a trust fund for my care, while dropping all legal challenges to their inheritance of Grandma Rose's assets. As I sat in Wellington's office reading the judge's latest ruling, I felt like I was drowning in the injustice of it all. My parents had successfully destroyed my credibility, my relationships, my career, and my mental health while positioning themselves as the reasonable, caring family members who just wanted to help their troubled daughter. They had turned the legal system itself into a weapon against me, using every lever of power and influence to ensure that their version of events would be accepted as truth. But even in that darkest moment, I knew I couldn't give up. Grandma Rose had trusted me to carry on her legacy, and she had left me the evidence I needed to expose the truth. The fight wasn't over until a judge heard everything I had to say about what really happened to her final will and how far my family had gone to cover up their betrayal of her trust. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, Mrs. Helen Anderson made a decision that would change everything. The 73-year-old woman had been watching the media coverage of our legal battle with growing outrage, seeing how my parents were portraying themselves as victims while painting me as mentally unstable. Despite her age and the obvious risks of opposing such a well-funded legal campaign, she decided she couldn't remain silent while lies were being told about her dear friend Margaret Rose Mitchell. Mrs. Anderson contacted Wellington's office and requested a meeting where she could provide evidence that would expose the true scope of my parents' deception. When we met at her house, she led me to a room I'd never seen before, lined with sophisticated security equipment that would have been impressive in a much younger person's home. "I've been documenting everything that happened to your grandmother," she said with quiet determination. "I knew something wasn't right, and I wanted to have proof if anyone ever questioned what really happened during those final months." The security system Mrs. Anderson had installed captured not just video footage, but audio recordings of conversations that took place in Grandma Rose's backyard and kitchen, areas that were clearly visible and audible from her property line. Over the course of 6 months, she had accumulated dozens of hours of recordings showing my parents' systematic manipulation and intimidation of their own mother. The conversations we listened to that day made my stomach turn with their casual cruelty and calculated pressure. In one particularly damning recording from 2 months before Grandma Rose's death, we could hear my father threatening to cut off all contact with his grandchildren if she didn't agree to change her will. "You want to see Brandon's kids grow up, don't you, Mom?" he said in a tone that was barely controlled menace. "Well, that's going to be pretty difficult if you keep being stubborn about this inheritance nonsense. Sarah doesn't need a business, she has a teaching job. But we've got real financial problems that need to be solved now." My mother's voice was even worse, combining emotional manipulation with barely veiled threats about Grandma Rose's care and living situation. "We're the ones who check on you every day, Mother. We're the ones who make sure you have groceries and transportation and help with your medications. If you're going to choose Sarah over your own son, maybe you should ask her to take over all those responsibilities too. See how long her concern lasts when she has to deal with the reality of caring for an elderly parent." The recordings also captured conversations between my parents when they thought they were alone in Grandma Rose's backyard, discussing their strategy for manipulating her will and their backup plans if she refused to cooperate. In one chilling exchange, my father talked about increasing Grandma Rose's medications to make her more compliant with their requests, while my mother discussed the importance of keeping me away from the house during their negotiations with her. Most shocking of all was a recording made just days after Grandma Rose's funeral, where my parents celebrated their successful deception and discussed how they would handle any challenge to the forged will. "Sarah's too trusting and too naive to figure out what really happened," my mother said with obvious satisfaction. "And even if she does, who's going to believe her over us? We'll just say she's having a breakdown over grief, get some doctors to back us up, and she'll be lucky if she doesn't end up in a psychiatric facility." Mrs. Anderson had also captured footage of Harold Sterling visiting Grandma Rose's house at odd hours, carrying briefcases and manila envelopes that clearly contained legal documents. The security footage showed him entering through the back door, avoiding the front entrance where neighbors might see him coming and going. On one particularly damning recording, we could see Sterling and my parents staging what appeared to be a will signing ceremony, with Grandma Rose looking confused and disoriented as they guided her through the process. The evidence Mrs. Anderson provided was devastating to my parents' credibility, but it also revealed the extent to which they had been willing to abuse and manipulate an elderly woman who trusted them completely. The recordings showed Grandma Rose becoming increasingly fearful and isolated as my parents tightened their control over her life, cutting off her contact with friends and family members who might have questioned what was happening. Mrs. Anderson's testimony was particularly powerful because of her character and credibility. She was a retired nurse who had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years, with no financial stake in our legal battle and no reason to fabricate evidence against my parents. Her detailed logs of suspicious activity, combined with her professional medical observations about Grandma Rose's declining emotional state, created a compelling narrative of elder abuse that went far beyond simple financial fraud. The audio recordings also captured Harold Sterling making incriminating statements about his cooperation with my parents' scheme. In one conversation, he could be heard complaining about the stress of falsifying legal documents and worrying about potential consequences if their fraud was discovered. "I don't like doing this, Richard," he said in a voice heavy with anxiety. "If anyone finds out what we've done, I'll lose my license and probably go to jail. You better make sure your crazy daughter doesn't figure out what happened." When Wellington presented Mrs. Anderson's evidence to the court, the reaction was immediate and dramatic. Judge Harrison, who had been so skeptical of our previous claims, was visibly shaken by the recordings of my parents threatening and manipulating their own mother. The audio evidence was particularly powerful because it captured their voices saying things that no reasonable person could interpret as anything other than elder abuse and estate fraud. Harold Sterling, faced with clear evidence of his own voice discussing the forgery conspiracy, finally abandoned any pretense of innocence and provided a full confession to investigators. His detailed testimony revealed not just the mechanics of how the will was forged, but also the psychological pressure my parents had used to force his cooperation. They had threatened to expose his financial problems and report him to the Bar Association unless he helped them defraud Grandma Rose. Sterling's confession also revealed additional crimes that even we hadn't suspected. My parents had been systematically stealing from Grandma Rose for months before her death, using their access to her house to take valuable items that they then sold to cover their gambling debts and credit card bills. They had also been intercepting her mail and monitoring her phone calls to prevent her from seeking help or advice from anyone outside their control. The most heartbreaking part of Sterling's testimony was his description of Grandma Rose's final weeks, when she had begun to suspect what was happening but was too intimidated and isolated to seek help. She had attempted to contact Thomas Brennan several times, but my parents had intercepted her calls and convinced Sterling to tell her that Brennan was unavailable. She died believing that she had no allies and no way to protect the legacy she had worked so hard to build. Dr. Patricia Hughes, Grandma Rose's longtime physician, also came forward after learning about the recordings that mentioned medication manipulation. Her testimony revealed that my parents had been pressuring her to prescribe unnecessary medications for Grandma Rose, claiming she was anxious and having trouble sleeping. The medications they requested were known to cause confusion and memory problems in elderly patients, which would have made it much easier for them to manipulate her decisions about legal and financial matters. Dr. Hughes had been reluctant to prescribe the medications because she could find no medical justification for them, but my parents had been persistent in their requests. They had even suggested switching Grandma Rose to a different doctor who might be more understanding of her needs, a threat that Dr. Hughes now understood was intended to pressure her into compliance with their scheme. Armed with Mrs. Anderson's recordings, Sterling's full confession, and Dr. Hughes's medical testimony, Wellington filed a motion for emergency hearings to address what was clearly a case of systematic elder abuse and fraud. The evidence was so overwhelming that even Judge Harrison, who had been skeptical throughout the proceedings, was forced to acknowledge that my parents had committed serious crimes against their own mother. The final hearing took place on a cold February morning that I'll remember for the rest of my life. As I walked up those courthouse steps one more time, I could see my parents waiting near the entrance with their attorney, Hutchinson, who still seemed confident despite the mountain of evidence that had been accumulating against his clients. My mother was wearing her best dress and had styled her hair perfectly, while my father had chosen a conservative suit that made him look like the respectable businessman he'd always pretended to be. They were still playing their parts, still convinced they could manipulate the system one more time. When my parents saw me approaching, they exchanged those same eye rolls I'd witnessed so many times throughout this ordeal. My mother whispered something to my father that made him chuckle dismissively, and I could see them shaking their heads as if I was still just their delusional daughter who refused to accept reality. They had no idea that in a few hours, their entire facade would come crashing down around them, and the judge who had been so skeptical of my claims would finally understand the true scope of their betrayal. Judge Robert Harrison entered the courtroom with a demeanor that was noticeably different from our previous appearances. The recordings Mrs. Anderson had provided, combined with Sterling's confession and Dr. Hughes's testimony, had clearly shifted his perspective on the case. He looked directly at my parents as he took his seat, studying them with the sharp attention of someone who was seeing them clearly for the first time. The casual dismissiveness he'd shown toward me in earlier proceedings had been replaced by a focused intensity that suggested he understood the gravity of what we were about to address. Hutchinson's opening statement was a desperate attempt to salvage his client's credibility in the face of overwhelming evidence. He argued that the audio recordings were taken out of context, that Sterling's confession was unreliable because it was given under pressure, and that my parents' behavior, while perhaps insensitive, didn't rise to the level of criminal fraud. He painted them as loving children who had been trying to help their aging mother make practical decisions about her estate, only to find themselves falsely accused by a daughter who couldn't accept that she hadn't been chosen as the primary beneficiary. Wellington's response was methodical and devastating. He began with a timeline of events that showed how my parents had systematically isolated Grandma Rose from anyone who might have protected her interests. He played selected recordings that captured their threats, manipulation, and casual discussion of their fraudulent scheme. Each piece of audio evidence was more damning than the last, building a picture of elder abuse that was so comprehensive and calculating that even Hutchinson seemed to realize his client's situation was hopeless. The most powerful moment came when Wellington played the recording of my parents celebrating after Grandma Rose's funeral, laughing about how easy it had been to manipulate her and discussing their plans for destroying my credibility if I challenged their inheritance. The callousness in their voices as they talked about their dead mother's final months was shocking even to me, and I could see Judge Harrison's expression harden as he listened to their casual discussion of fraud and abuse. Harold Sterling's testimony was the centerpiece of our case, and his detailed confession left no doubt about the scope of the conspiracy. He walked the court through every step of the will forgery process, explaining how my parents had provided him with copies of Grandma Rose's signature and handwriting samples that he used to create the fraudulent document. He described the payments they made to secure his cooperation and the ongoing pressure they applied to ensure his silence throughout the legal proceedings. Sterling's testimony was particularly devastating because he was able to provide specific details that only someone directly involved in the conspiracy could have known. He described conversations with my parents where they discussed strategies for discrediting me, including the fake mental health crisis narrative and the criminal charges that were designed to destroy my credibility. He even revealed that they had coached Jessica and Brandon on their testimony, helping them create false stories about my supposedly unstable behavior. When Mrs. Anderson took the stand, her testimony provided the emotional context that made the technical evidence of fraud personally devastating. She described watching Grandma Rose become increasingly fearful and isolated in her final months, cut off from the social connections that had sustained her throughout her life. She talked about finding Grandma Rose crying in her garden after particularly brutal confrontations with my parents, and about her growing concern that something terrible was happening to her dear friend. Mrs. Anderson's description of Grandma Rose's final weeks was heartbreaking. She painted a picture of an intelligent, vibrant woman who had been reduced to a frightened victim through systematic emotional abuse and manipulation. The security footage she had captured showed Grandma Rose's physical and emotional deterioration as my parents tightened their control over her life, using their access and authority to prevent her from seeking help or protection. Dr. Hughes's medical testimony provided the clinical evidence of how my parents had used medication to make Grandma Rose more compliant with their demands. She explained how the unnecessary sedatives and anxiety medications they had pressured her to prescribe would have affected an elderly patient's cognitive function and decision-making ability. The medical evidence showed that Grandma Rose had been chemically impaired during the final weeks of her life, making it impossible for her to make informed decisions about her legal and financial affairs. The most dramatic moment of the entire proceeding came when Wellington played Grandma Rose's video recording from the safety deposit box. Seeing her on screen, speaking directly to the camera about her fears and her true intentions for her estate, was emotionally overwhelming for everyone in the courtroom. Her voice was strong and clear as she explained her decision to leave everything to me, and her specific concerns about my parents' financial problems and their pressure tactics. In the video, Grandma Rose looked directly at the camera and said, "If my son Richard and his wife Diane are claiming that I wanted to leave everything to them, they are lying. I have made my wishes crystal clear in my legal documents, and Sarah is the only member of my family who has the integrity and judgment to carry on the work I've spent my life building." The directness of her statement, combined with the date stamp showing it was recorded just weeks before her death, demolished any remaining credibility my parents might have had. As the evidence mounted, I could see my parents beginning to panic. They had been whispering urgently with Hutchinson throughout the proceedings, and their confident facade was cracking under the weight of the testimony against them. My father kept wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool temperature in the courtroom, while my mother's hands were shaking as she tried to maintain her composed appearance. The breaking point came when Wellington played the recording of my parents discussing their plans to increase Grandma Rose's medications to make her more manageable. Judge Harrison's face showed genuine shock and disgust as he heard them casually planning to drug their own mother to facilitate their fraud. At that moment, I could see that he finally understood that these weren't loving children who had made mistakes, but predators who had systematically abused a vulnerable elderly woman. Judge Harrison's questioning of my parents was sharp and unforgiving. When my father tried to explain away the recordings as family discussions taken out of context, the judge cut him off and demanded specifics about the payments to Sterling and the staged will-signing ceremony. When my mother attempted to portray their behavior as concern for Grandma Rose's welfare, Judge Harrison asked her to explain how drugging an elderly woman and threatening to cut off contact with grandchildren could possibly be considered caring behavior. The most satisfying moment was when my parents finally turned on each other under the pressure of Judge Harrison's questioning. My father blamed my mother for pushing him into the scheme, claiming she had been the one demanding access to Grandma Rose's money to cover her shopping debts. My mother fired back that the gambling debts were his problem and that she had only gone along with his plan because he had threatened to divorce her if she didn't cooperate. Their mutual betrayal in front of the court was the final nail in the coffin of their credibility. When Judge Harrison called for a recess before delivering his ruling, I knew that justice was finally within reach. The truth about what had happened to Grandma Rose had been revealed in its full, horrifying scope, and there was no way for my parents to continue hiding behind their false accusations about my mental state. The woman they had tried to destroy was about to be vindicated, and the elderly mother they had abused was finally going to receive the justice she deserved. Judge Harrison's ruling was swift, comprehensive, and unequivocal in its condemnation of my parents' actions. In 40 years on the bench, he began, his voice heavy with disgust, I have rarely encountered such a systematic and callous abuse of an elderly victim by her own children. The evidence presented in this case reveals a conspiracy that goes far beyond simple estate fraud to encompass elder abuse, document forgery, perjury, and witness intimidation. He declared Harold Sterling's forged will null and void, ordering the immediate recognition of Grandma Rose's true final wishes as documented in the safety deposit box. The judge's ruling required my parents to make full restitution for everything they had stolen or sold from Grandma Rose's estate, including the antique shop they had liquidated and the Victorian house they had sold below market value. Since many of the items were gone forever, they would be required to compensate me based on professional appraisals of their fair market value. Judge Harrison also ordered them to pay my legal fees, the costs of Wellington's investigation, and additional punitive damages for the emotional distress they had caused through their systematic campaign of character assassination. More importantly, Judge Harrison referred the case to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution on charges of elder abuse, fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. He specifically noted that my parents had committed these crimes against one of society's most vulnerable members, an elderly woman who trusted them completely and depended on them for care and protection. The judge's language made it clear that he expected the criminal justice system to pursue the most serious possible charges against them. Harold Sterling faced immediate consequences for his role in the conspiracy. The State Bar Association had been monitoring the proceedings, and they moved quickly to begin disbarment proceedings that would permanently end his legal career. He also faced criminal charges for forgery, fraud, and conspiracy, though his cooperation with our investigation would likely result in a more lenient sentence than my parents would receive. Sterling's law practice was immediately shut down, and all of his current cases were transferred to other attorneys while investigators reviewed his files for evidence of additional fraudulent activity. The criminal case against my parents moved forward rapidly, as the evidence Wellington had assembled made prosecution straightforward. Within weeks, they were indicted on multiple felony counts that carried the possibility of significant prison time. The same media outlets that had portrayed them as dignified victims now covered their perp walk in court appearances, showing them in handcuffs and orange jumpsuits rather than the expensive clothes they had worn during the civil proceedings. Jessica and Brandon were forced to confront their own complicity in the conspiracy, particularly their false testimony about my mental health and their role in the character assassination campaign. While they weren't charged criminally, they faced serious questions from investigators about their knowledge of the will forgery and their participation in spreading lies about my psychological condition. Both of them eventually admitted that our parents had coached them on their testimony and pressured them to portray me as unstable, though they claimed they hadn't understood the full scope of the fraud at the time. The vindication felt surreal after months of having every aspect of my character and credibility attacked by my own family. The criminal charges against me were immediately dropped, and I received formal apologies from the school board, which reinstated me to my teaching position with back pay for the time I'd been suspended. The psychological evaluation that had questioned my grip on reality was officially withdrawn from court records, and the psychiatrist who had conducted it faced professional review for his biased and inadequate assessment. With my inheritance secured and my reputation restored, I faced the bittersweet task of rebuilding everything my parents had destroyed. The antique shop could never be recreated exactly as Grandma Rose had left it, since so many unique and irreplaceable pieces had been scattered to collectors around the country. However, I was able to locate and repurchase some of the most significant items, and I began the slow process of rebuilding the inventory with pieces that would have met Grandma Rose's exacting standards for craftsmanship and historical value. Reopening the shop became a community effort that demonstrated how many people had been touched by Grandma Rose's kindness and integrity throughout her 40 years in business. Former customers donated pieces from their collections, local artisans offered to create new inventory in traditional styles, and other antique dealers provided guidance and support as I learned to navigate the complex world of estate sales, auctions, and private collections. The shop that reopened 6 months later was different from Grandma Rose's original, but it carried the same commitment to quality and historical preservation that had made her business special. The emotional healing was more complex than the financial and legal restoration. The betrayal by my parents, Jessica and Brandon, had damaged my ability to trust family relationships in ways that would take years to fully address. I began working with a therapist who specialized in family trauma, learning to process the grief of losing not just Grandma Rose, but also the illusion that my parents were capable of love and loyalty. The realization that they had been willing to destroy me completely to protect their theft was perhaps the most painful part of the entire ordeal. My friendship with Maria Gonzalez, who had sheltered me during the darkest period of the legal battle, became the foundation for building a new kind of family based on choice rather than blood relations. Mrs. Anderson, whose courage in coming forward had made justice possible, became a surrogate grandmother figure who helped me understand how to honor Grandma Rose's memory while building my own independent life. Dr. Hughes, Wellington, and even Thomas Brennan became part of an extended support network that replaced the family relationships that had been destroyed by betrayal and greed. The shop's reopening celebration was attended by hundreds of people who wanted to honor Grandma Rose's memory and support my efforts to continue her work. The event featured displays about the shop's history, demonstrations of antique restoration techniques, and presentations about the historical significance of various pieces in our collection. Local news coverage focused on the positive story of a granddaughter honoring her grandmother's legacy rather than the sensational drama that had dominated headlines during the legal battle. Perhaps the most meaningful part of rebuilding was discovering letters and cards that Grandma Rose's customers had written over the years, expressing gratitude for her help in finding special pieces for their homes or her patience in teaching them about antique care and preservation. Reading their words helped me understand that I wasn't just inheriting a business, but continuing a tradition of service to people who valued craftsmanship, history, and beauty in their daily lives. Grandma Rose had built something much more significant than a retail operation. She had created a place where people could connect with the past and find meaning in objects that carried stories across generations. The legal victory also opened doors to advocacy work that I hadn't expected. Wellington introduced me to organizations that worked to prevent elder abuse and protect vulnerable adults from financial exploitation. My experience became part of educational programs that taught families and caregivers to recognize signs of abuse and manipulation. Speaking about what had happened to Grandma Rose was difficult, but it felt like another way of honoring her memory and ensuring that her suffering had meaning beyond our family's story. 2 years after the judge's ruling, my parents were sentenced to prison terms that reflected the severity of their crimes against Grandma Rose. My father received 7 years for his leadership role in the conspiracy, while my mother received 5 years for her participation in the elder abuse and fraud. They would also face years of supervised probation after their release, during which they would be prohibited from having unsupervised contact with elderly family members or serving in any fiduciary capacity. Harold Sterling received 3 years for his role in the document forgery, and his legal career was permanently ended. The day I received the keys to Grandma Rose's restored Victorian house was both triumphant and bittersweet. Walking through rooms where she had lived and worked for decades, I could feel her presence in every carefully chosen detail and lovingly maintained piece of furniture. The house needed extensive work to undo the damage from my parents' hasty sale and the subsequent owner's improvements, but restoring it to its original character became a labor of love that connected me to Grandma Rose's aesthetic vision and commitment to preserving beautiful things. Living in her house and running her shop gave me daily reminders of the values she had tried to teach me throughout my childhood: integrity, persistence, respect for craftsmanship, and the importance of standing up for what's right even when the cost is high. The legal battle had tested every one of those lessons, forcing me to choose between family loyalty and truth, between social acceptance and justice, between the easy path of surrender and the difficult path of fighting for what Grandma Rose had earned through decades of honest work. The most profound lesson came from understanding that real family isn't determined by blood relationships, but by the people who choose to support, protect, and believe in each other when times are difficult. Mrs. Anderson, Maria, Wellington, Dr. Hughes, and dozens of customers and friends had shown me more loyalty and love during the legal battle than my biological family had demonstrated in 28 years. They had become my chosen family, united not by genetics but by shared values and mutual respect. As I write this story, 5 years have passed since that cold February morning when Judge Harrison delivered his ruling. The antique shop is thriving, the house has been beautifully restored, and I've built a life that honors Grandma Rose's memory while creating new traditions and relationships that reflect who I choose to be rather than the family I happen to be born into. The legal victory was important, but the personal growth that came from surviving my family's betrayal and building something positive from the wreckage has been even more valuable. I think about Grandma Rose every day as I work in the shop she built, helping customers find pieces that will become part of their own family stories and traditions. Sometimes I imagine what she would think about how everything turned out, whether she would be proud of the woman I became through the trial by fire she never intended to create. I believe she would be satisfied that justice was served, that her true wishes were ultimately honored, and that the business she built continues to serve people who value the same things she cherished throughout her remarkable life. What do you think about standing up for justice even when your own family turns against you? Have you ever had to choose between loyalty and truth in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know if you've faced similar situations where doing the right thing came with a personal cost. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more stories about finding strength in impossible situations. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who might benefit from knowing that sometimes justice really does prevail, even when the odds seem completely stacked against you. Thank you for taking this journey with me, and remember that the truth has a power that no amount of money, manipulation, or family pressure can ultimately defeat. May you always have the courage to stand up for what's right, even when everyone around you thinks you're wrong.